Nazi Germany had a parliament just for show, and it was hosted inside of a place called the Kroll Opera, or the Kroll Opera House. What was that? There's nothing there today if you go to look at it. It does have a really important, really interesting history, and of course, as the rubber stamp parliament of Nazi Germany, some of the most fateful decisions for Germany and the world were made inside of its grand hall. So I want to tell you all about it. The Kroll Opera used to sit on the western edge of the Königsplatz, a great big square in the center of Berlin named for the king. On its eastern edge, from the 1890s, sat the Reichstag, purpose-built as a parliament for a unified Germany, and still there and still serving that purpose today, although of course it's had its many ups and downs along the way. And then in the center between the two, surrounded by statues of Bismarck and Prussian generals, was the Siegersäule, the victory column, built to celebrate the Prussian victories over Denmark, Austria and France in the middle of the 19th century that led to the formation of the modern German state with the Prussian king as the German emperor. That has actually survived, but of course it was moved under the Nazis to make way for their Welthauptstadt Germania plans. It was moved into the neighboring Tiergarten Park and made taller for their own future victories. You can still visit it today. And so that leaves us with the Kroll Opera on the western side of the square, which is actually the oldest of the three. It opened its doors in 1844 and is named after its original owner, Joseph Kroll. He was given special permission by the King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, to build this leisure and pleasure center for the Berliners. Its architect was Karl Ferdinand Langhans, whose father is probably a bit better known than him. His father is the man who is behind the most famous monument in Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate. Still, the son made a very opulent entertainment center with room for 5,000 attendees, and it featured gas lighting as well. It was built in the 1840s though, which was quite a turbulent time. We look at 1848 and we see revolutions all across Europe, or at least attempted ones, including in Berlin. And actually Joseph Kroll would die in that year, 1848, and so would begin several decades of the Kroll Opera really struggling to keep its doors open. It bounces around between different owners, and whilst it is a place that's quite beloved, it's one of those places that's just never really making much money. And so in 1895, it's bought by the Prussian state. That actually made it the second state-owned opera house in Prussia. The other one is perhaps a lot more famous, and that still stands today, the Staatsoper, built under Frederick the Great and designed by the man with the best German name I've ever come across, Graf Georg Wenceslaus von Knobelsdorff. That's been standing there since the 1740s. So what did the Prussian state do with a second opera house? Well, they made it the kind of lighter, more fun one. Operettas were played there. It's something that was seen as being a little bit more accessible. However, the final emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, didn't think too much of it. He liked things that were even bigger, grander, more overblown. I mean, look at the Reichstag building, the Berliner Dome, or the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church. And he wanted to demolish the Kroll Opera and build something even more fancy, I suppose, in its place. And demolition works did begin in 1914, and then Kaiser Wilhelm II reassessed his priorities with World War I, and that demolition was never fully carried out. In fact, I did read somewhere that it was used as a kind of makeshift hospital during the First World War. Of course, Kaiser Wilhelm will be kicked out at the end of that war, and yeah, the fate of the opera house will change. Its doors actually remain closed until 1924, when it reopens thanks to the people behind the People's Stage, the Volksbühne. However, it was in 1927 that the place would see its real change. This is when it separated from the Prussian state opera and began to be led by a conductor and music leader named Otto Klemperer. And it's under him that this place became known for being experimental. You'd see very strange sets, hear dissonant music, a place that was really pushing the boundaries, a place that really exemplifies Weimar Berlin culture as we would look at it today. And of course, as is typical for things that were pushing at the boundaries at that time, it was dubbed by people on the right, be they conservatives, nationalists, Nazis, as decadent, as un-German, as being run and controlled by Jews, as representing cultural Bolshevism. This, combined with the Wall Street crash of 1929 that had a knock-on effect destroying the German economy, meant that once again the Kroll Opera was struggling to keep its doors open. There was one great big final show there in July of 1931, and it would then shut its doors for a couple of years until it reopened as the Parliament in Nazi Germany in 1933. When the Kroll Opera shut its doors in 1931, the Nazis were polling at around 18%. By the end of 1932, they have around about 1/3 of the vote in Germany. Thanks to a backroom deal, Hitler is able to form a government by the 30th of January 1933, and of course 4 weeks later, on the 27th of February, on the opposite side of the Königsplatz, the Reichstag building is set on fire. The fire is very publicly blamed on the communists. We're not going to go into so much details of the Reichstag fire here, but it is to say that there is a sense of emergency among the German people that then allows the Nazis to arrest members of the Communist Party all over the country and imprison them in prisons that are run by party members, not state prisons. There's a sense of danger and fear, and the Nazis jump on that. And at the beginning of March 33, they host an election nationally, and they soar in popularity up to 44%. Even when they are running their own polling stations and counting their own votes, I always like to point out they still don't get 51%. Well, the Reichstag will then convene, will meet inside of the Kroll Opera, which of course has been sat empty, on the 23rd of March 1933. It was decked out inside with red swastika banners, and it was stuffed full with Nazi brown shirts and SS, whose job it was, of course, to intimidate the parliamentarians that were going to come in and vote on the Enabling Act, vote on whether or not democracy should be suspended while the crisis is averted, thanks to their great leader, Adolf Hitler. Well, most parliamentarians did vote in favor of ending democracy, 444 of them. The only party that voted against was the SPD. 94 of them voted no to the Enabling Act. The leader of the party at the time was Otto Wels, who said, "Wir sind wehrlos, aber nicht ehrlos." We are defenseless, but at least we are not without honor. He gave a speech about human rights inside of the parliament, and the Nazis laughed at him. By the end of the day, there was no more democracy in Germany. Over the next months, all other political parties in the country were outlawed, were disbanded. But to really seal the deal, by the end of the year, by November of 1933, the Nazi Party decided to host nationwide elections. No longer were there multiple different parties there and people that you could vote for. There was simply a list approved by the Nazis that you could vote yes for, or you could vote against. Well, turnout was over 90%, and over 90% of people also voted in favor of that list. Now it was only Nazis or people that they approved of that would sit in this essentially fake parliament, a place that had become a stage now of a very different kind to that for which it was intended. The Reichstag would meet very rarely after this. The Nazis used it when they wanted to take photographs of people cheering and agreeing so that they could essentially put on a show the people who they were, what they stood for, and what is happening next in this country. Case in point, 1935, the Reichstag was specially convened not in the Kroll Opera, but in Nuremberg to pass the Nuremberg laws, the race laws that would remove citizenship from black Germans, from those labeled as gypsies, and from Jews. The Nuremberg race laws would also include the law on the purity of German blood, when the Nazis published these family trees that show you a pure Aryan German on one side, and then you can see how the bloodline, according to them, gets increasingly poisoned the more Jews one has in their family tree, leading to a full Jew in Nazi parlance having 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. This, of course, would become a death sentence for millions of people. The Reichstag, though, would more often meet in Berlin in the Kroll Opera. We can see this in 1936 when Hitler gives a rousing speech when people stand up and cheer as he announces that the German military is going to reoccupy the Rhineland, something that they haven't been allowed to do since the end of the First World War as a part of the Treaty of Versailles that is supposed to be enforced by Britain and France, who just look on. Many politicians, particularly in Britain, of course, where I'm from, looking on and going, well, if we let him have that inch, maybe he won't take the yard. In 1938, there is another speech inside the Kroll Opera where he announces that Austria is being brought home into the Reich. This is, of course, the announcement of the annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss, a forcible invasion. Yes, of course, there were also Austrian Nazis, but they never represented a majority. And Austria, in the eyes of the Nazi Party, as a result of this, is named part of Germany proper, something that's a bit different to other occupations that will take place across Europe. Hitler would then give two very important speeches in the Reichstag in 1939. On the 30th of January that year, marking 6 years since he came to power, he talked about the next war in Europe. If Europe should again be plunged into world war, he said, it was the Jewish race that would be annihilated. One of the very few times that Hitler uses words to that effect, talking about the complete annihilation, complete destruction of the Jewish race. Previously, of course, he had talked about how they were a poison, about how they should be kicked out of the country to purify the German state. But to talk about them being annihilated outright, and years before, about 3 years before, the party would put together what Heydrich called the final solution. I mean, this is a very important moment and a very important signifier, and saying it during peacetime as well. 1939 is the year that war would come, the year that war would start, and so it is on the 1st of September that year that Hitler would give a speech in the Kroll Opera stating that it was Germany that had been invaded by Poland and that Germany was now fighting back against the enemy. Of course, he, and I assume everybody inside the building, knew the truth, knew that, of course, it was Germany who was the aggressor, Germany who had invaded Poland. Within a few weeks, Poland would capitulate entirely, would be completely occupied, of course, not just by Germany, but by their short-term allies, the Soviet Union as well. Now, it was during the war that the stakes were higher. The Reichstag would meet less often. There was this sense of urgency and to portray the idea of acting quickly, acting decisively. It's very telling, though, that the Reichstag would meet on the 11th of December 1941, a kind of mirror image from September 1st, 1939. This time Germany was at war with the United States. This was, of course, in the wake of the Japanese Pearl Harbor attacks. It was on the 26th of April 1942 that the Reichstag would meet in the Kroll Opera under the Nazis for the final time. By this point, Hitler was frustrated with all of his generals and officials getting in his way. He knew best, he knew how to fight and run this war, and so he declared himself supreme judge of the German people. Even this image, this semblance of democracy, of consensus, was now completely gone. Curiously, the opera would then play inside of the building for the next few months as the Staatsoper on Unter den Linden was destroyed in the war. But the Kroll Opera itself would be hit by the RAF and be completely devastated on the 22nd of November 1943. After this, the next important piece of history for the Kroll Opera really is 1945. It's across the way from the Reichstag. Well, the Reichstag was deemed as the grand final prize, the signifier of German power by Stalin. Stalin, of course, had told two generals, Zhukov and Konev, one of you is going to take the Reichstag and go down in history, one of you is going to be the other guy. And so, at the end of April and beginning of May 45, as the Soviets crossed the Spree from north of the Kroll Opera, they will pass by the ruins of this building. Those ruins will be turned into something of a beer garden once the war has come to an end, but the ruins themselves will be completely demolished by 1957, leaving the open space that has sat there until quite recently when a sign was put up that is, again, quite tellingly, in Polish. I've had a few Polish people mention to me over the years that we have all these memorials in Berlin, but we don't have one for the Polish people. And so it might not be, in my opinion, the best, this great big stone that's there, but there is now at least something that mentions the 6 million Poles, roughly 50% of which were Jewish, that were killed by the Germans or killed as a result of the Second World War, let's say. And so that's it for the Kroll Opera. Thanks for watching along. I hope you learned something. This show is supported by lovely people on Patreon. I wouldn't be able to do it without you. Their names are down here, and your name can be down here too. If you would please go along, click the link, and sign up. Thank you very much for watching. That's the end of this one. Goodbye.